In the last 25 minutes, we have introduced you to a little of the Sahara Desert. The Sahara Desert is the biggest desert in the world. It's 3.5 million square miles. We've also introduced you to a group of youngsters, young people from Toxteth, from a community school in Toxteth by the name of Shorefields. What would a group of young Toxteth students be doing in the middle of the Sahara? The answer is that they were on expedition. Since 1970, youngsters from the inner city of Liverpool, from Shorefields School, have been involved with a series of 9 expeditions to the Sahara. And these expeditions have been created and sustained from within the school. This is the story of one of those expeditions. One from 1988. When we had 28 people in 2 vehicles setting off once again for an expedition to the Sahara. The expedition is overland. Unfortunately, there are some bits of water in the way, the English Channel and the Mediterranean. So we crossed the Mediterranean from Spain to Morocco by ferry. Might look a little small, but, well, this isn't the real ferry, this is a little fishing boat off the Moroccan coast. Because the first thing that we have to do on arriving in Morocco is to spend the best part of a week acclimatizing. And we acclimatize to the heat and to the culture. It would be easy to drive away from the coast on good tarmac roads straight down into the desert, but at the end of it, the youngsters would be wrecked. Wrecked because they would be facing heat that was completely unfamiliar. So acclimatization is an important part of their experience. Acclimatization means swimming, lying on the beach, playing, and generally having a good time and relaxing after a week's hard drive through Europe. They also become familiar with new towns. Towns unlike the towns at home, and a landscape which is unlike the landscape at home. They're now in rural Africa. They travel across the wheatlands of Morocco and soon find that they're into a completely different world. This is the world of the small farmer. And whenever we camped up at night, the children from the farms would wander into our camp and just sit and watch. We were never far away from people who were just sitting and watching. From Morocco, we travel into Algeria. Through rural Algeria, across the Atlas Mountains, and then, at last, after about 2.5 weeks, we're into the Sahara. And everyone's idea of the Sahara is that it is a place of sand dunes. We've all seen Ice Cold in Alex, and we've seen those old army ambulances slogging their way across trackless sand dune wastes. Well, there are trackless sand dune wastes, but they're only part of the desert. The desert does strange things to people. One of our staff members had the ambition to play golf in the biggest bunker in the world. And so on our first night in the Sahara, he set up his golf tee, got his balls out, and started whacking golf balls up the side of a sand dune. He got himself the record. He played golf in the biggest bunker in the world. Although the Sahara is such an enormous desert, it's not empty. There are about 2 million people living in the Sahara. People from many different tribes, from many different groups. Many of them are nomadic. And as soon as we come to the wells, we meet the nomads. And at first, it's a great temptation to see them as something of a curiosity. And the youngsters rush up to them with their cameras and stick long lenses up their noses and generally behave like tourists. But that soon passes. We also find that we are as much of an attraction to the local people as they are to us. And we soon get used to the idea of the children coming around and just standing and staring. At first, this was something which was rather unnerving to our youngsters. After all, they came from an inner city community where, well, people minded their own business. They didn't really stand and stare. Well, we explained to them that if a caravan train appeared in their local park and a gang of nomads in long robes and headdresses started to set up tents in their park, that I'm quite sure that the local children would do exactly what the children here are doing. They'd stand. And of course, when you see them at English, then there is plenty to stand and stare at. The expedition isn't a holiday for the youngsters. They have to work and make the expedition work. They have the job of running the expedition. This might seem a tall order at first, but initially they work with the members of staff. Here we have the nurse with one of her assistants tending to one of the youngsters who's got some minor injury, blisters or cut toes. The assistant gradually learns the job of the nursing, and the same applies to the mechanics and to the cooks and to all the other many jobs which have to be carried out on the expedition. It's also a chance for the youngsters to learn new skills amongst themselves. They teach each other. They learn from each other and from the staff. And it doesn't matter whether it's fixing a Walkman, or sewing up ripped clothes, or sorting out baggage. These skills have to be learned because the comfort of everyone on the expedition depends on them. As we head down into the desert, so routines become established. Just before sunset each evening, we try and find somewhere to camp. In the wide open space of the desert, that's not too difficult. Camp is set up by placing the two vehicles and leaving a space between. And in that space, we set up the tables and the benches, some for cooking on and some to sit and eat the meal. And over the years we've found that sitting down to a shared meal is a great way of building a community spirit and keeping the expedition together. Each day a different duty group helps the cooks. And the duty group is responsible for all the chores. The dishwashing, the clearing up, the stacking away of the dishes, all the jobs which we take so much for granted at home. And yet they know that when they have finished their job for the day, it will be another week before it's their turn again. But woe betide anybody who tries to take a shortcut, because any bit of food left on a dirty plate, any cutlery that's not washed properly, any table that's not scrubbed down can end up with the whole camp going down with bad guts and dysentery, because dirt attracts disease, and disease can run through an expedition like this and lay everybody low. Many of the things that we take for granted at home we find aren't quite the same when they're out in the desert. For example, water, which comes from a tap at home, has to be worked for. It might be that in order to get a wash, you have to compete with a herd of camels and chase them away so you can get to the camel trough and dip your hot feet into the cool water. It might be that instead of having a nice comfortable shower or a bath at home, that you have to squeeze down into an irrigation sump. These two appear to be enjoying themselves. I don't know what's going down below, but they've certainly got happy grins on their faces. We meet other travellers in the desert. Sometimes they're motorised. Here we've come across two young Germans in a car. Not exactly the sort of thing for a desert crossing. The inevitable has happened, and they've wrecked their front suspension. We came along and found that, yes, they needed help. So we hitched up a tow, and we towed them for the next 12 hours until we came to the next oasis. Those first few days in the desert are really hard work for the youngsters. It's physically demanding, and even more, it's mentally demanding. The temperature rises, 110, 120 degrees becomes commonplace. And who really knows what 120 degrees is like until they get there? And in the middle of the day, as the temperature rises, who knows how hot it's going to become? And they worry, are they going to be able to cope? Are they going to be able to manage this incredible heat? But they do. The day comes to an end, the temperature drops, it becomes cool. And a nighttime temperature of only 90 or 95 degrees feels pleasant, and they can lie in their camp beds and forget about the heat of the day. And so southwards towards the Hogger Mountains, the first target of the expedition. This is an area which has been visited by many of our previous trips. Here in the village of Hirafok, we meet up with some of our Tuareg friends, and we load up with water for the next stage of the expedition. But here, there's no tap. Instead, we have to get the ropes and buckets out and haul water from a deep well. There are a number of settlements in the Hogger. Some of them have got deep wells which have got irrigation pumps to lift water. These pumps have been put in by the government. The idea is that each settlement will become self-sufficient in fruit and vegetables, and that the surplus will be sold in the larger oases. Unfortunately, many of the pumps have broken down. We've got many friends here. So as soon as we arrived, we were given the job of setting our mechanics to mend the pumps. And we had 6 such pumps to mend in the first 10 days that we were in the Hogger. We had a number of projects which we wanted to tackle while we were in this area. And one of these was to run up towards the north to the mountain range of the Tefedest. A rough journey on very little used tracks. Adana, our Tuareg friend, went with us, accompanied by his 2 young sons. He took us on his shortcuts which left the normal tracks and went the way that the camels would go. Here we're still on the normal track. Adana's camel shortcuts were hairy indeed. The only puncture that we had in the whole time we were in Africa was on one of Adana's shortcuts. And here the youngsters are struggling with the 200 weights of a new wheel. Adana, like so many Tuaregs, has got a wide circle of relatives. Every settlement that we stopped at had some of Adana's relatives there. When we arrived at Mertutek, the settlement for the southern part of the Tefedest range, sure enough, Adana had relatives there. And when we went off up the wadi to camp, Adana stayed behind in the little jariba, the straw hut buildings of his cousin's home. What was the attraction of the Tefedest? Well, it's an area where people used to live many thousands of years ago, at a time when the Sahara was much greener. And there is evidence of these old settlements up in the caves amongst the boulders in the mountains. The cave paintings which were left by these Neolithic people are well hidden. So some of Adana's cousins had agreed that they would accompany us up into the mountains on the following day and help us to find some of the cave paintings. And we weren't disappointed. In rock shelters, hidden amongst the boulders, we found beautiful, delicate paintings of cattle, animals such as giraffes and elephants, the sort of thing which now you would only see down in the savanna lands of Central and West Africa. There's certainly no cattle left in the Sahara. It's quite an experience to sit in one of these shelters and look up at the paintings which have been put there maybe 6,000 years ago, and sit with your tin of sardines and your cream crackers and think, I wonder what the people who were painting these animal paintings were sitting eating 6,000 years ago. It was quite an exciting time for the youngsters. It was the first time they'd really had a chance to get away from the main expedition base, to get away from the vehicles, get out into the wilds and look for something that was considered to be real exploration. And then off on more of Adana's shortcuts. We had to cross the Tefedes from the west to the east. And then drive up the east side of the mountains through a mixture of gravel and sand, heading for the valley of the Ahates. The Wed Ahates was an area that we'd visited in 1985, and now we were to go back again, because here we'd been working on an inventory of prehistoric stone monuments. Again, one of Adana's shortcuts took us down into the upper reaches of the valley through this boulder field. Until eventually, down below, we could see the Ahates Valley. And in a stand of acacia trees, we set up our next base camp. There's plenty of evidence of past settlements in this area. Some of it, like this area here, is Tuareg settlement. The Tuaregs have lived in these mountains for many hundreds of years, and it's difficult to date these settlements. Who knows whether these were 5 years old, or 50 years old, or 500 years old. But they certainly made fascinating work for the youngsters who examined them. There was also evidence of much older cultures. Here one of the youngsters, who has found a Neolithic stone pestle, has also found 2 giraffes engraved on the rock. One of the problems is that when in the full sunlight, these engravings disappear completely. It's only when a shadow is cast that you can see the engraved outlines, the 2 giraffes on the rock wall. The Tefedes is a wild granite landscape. And this was an area where we were to spend several days exploring the mountains, clambering up amongst the rocks, and thoroughly enjoying the freedom of being out in mountains where not many people had visited. Adana and his 2 young sons enjoyed their time in base camp, particularly the food. They were fascinated by porridge with great big dollops of sugar and dollops of syrup. They didn't get that at home. And above all, the 2 little boys found that they had been adopted by a whole host of older brothers and sisters. and they liked nothing more than to sit on the knee of one of the drivers and play at lorry drivers. One of the projects which we'd planned was to walk in relays down the length of the Tefedest. This would have been a 3 or 4 day trek, walking along the crest of a mountain range which is some 60 miles from the north at Garat El Janoun, the Spirit Mountain, which is to the right of the photograph, at 7,000 feet, the highest mountain in the Tefedest, southwards to Mertutek at the southern end of the chain. The idea was that there would be a change of personnel at intervals, so that there were always fresh walkers. But before we attempted the whole walk, this time we were going to try a 1-day traverse, just to see if it was really possible. And so we travelled up with one vehicle from base in the Wadi Hates, 22 kilometres into the next wadi, the Tineket. And there, up at the head of the wadi, we could see the Garat El Janoun, the Spirit Mountain, marking the head of the chain of mountains down which we were to walk. There was 3,000 feet of climbing from the base level of the valley up onto the ridge. And these are the intrepid climbers. Their packs contained very little, mostly water. Everyone had to carry at least a gallon, because once up on the ridge there was no water. Headdresses. Headdresses of the kind the locals used, with lots of wrappings to keep out the heat and to keep in the moist air from the breath. And setting off up this rubble-strewn landscape, climbing up higher and higher out of the valley bottom. And the higher we went, the more the landscape opened out, rather like unfolding a map. It was hard work, and it was hot. And as midday approached, so we had to take more and more frequent stops. Although everyone had tanked up with water before leaving the vehicle, it wasn't long before everyone was pulling at their water flasks. Till eventually we reached the ridge, almost 7,000 feet, and now somewhat cooler. Looking out eastward, the plain was lost in a haze. The shade of a boulder was the place where we stopped for lunch, and lunch was rather unusual in itself, a tin of rice pudding. And then we had to look for a route southwards. But now we were on the level. But what a level! A rubble-strewn boulder field that we had to follow towards the head of the Wadi Hates again, southwards, away from Garat El Janoun. The afternoon wore on. Just after we headed down into the Wadi Hates, the sun set, and we walked on until moonset, about 11 o'clock at night. And by this time, all the water had gone. A small group headed off down the gorges back into base camp, where they arrived at 3 o'clock in the morning. And a support party who had been waiting up on the ridge earlier in the day set out at 3 in the morning, headed up the gorge to meet up at sunrise with the rest of the walkers who were still camped up in the wadi. What a great feeling it was to sit there and to have nice cool water sluicing down the throat again, and to be able to dibble into open tins for chunks of grapefruit and pineapple and slurp it all down after having been so dry overnight. And in the morning, the dark gorge that we'd struggled down the previous night looked almost kindly, and spirits rose again, because the youngsters knew that in the previous 24 hours they'd actually achieved something that would live with them for the rest of their lives. And then support party and ridge group set off down the mountain. And on the way down the mountain, they stopped at a water hole that we'd found. This had been found by 3 of the girls a few days previously. A nice, deep, cool cleft full of water. Bath time. And so the last few weary walkers made their way back down to base camp again. And what tales they had to tell. Water resupply in the Tefedes was something of a problem. But Adena knew of wells that weren't marked on our maps. It was while on an expedition to load up water at one of these wells that we found another area where there were prehistoric burial mounds in the ridges in the distance. We didn't have time to do more than a cursory survey of 2 or 3 of these mounds, but this is an area on the far east side of the mountains which would do well for a return visit. And so back to Hirafok. But we didn't go back empty-handed. No, Adena was collecting timber. He had trees which were, in inverted commas, his trees. And he cut some branches from them because his friend was building a new house. And the branches were needed to make a roof and to make doorposts. So there, bundled on either side of the lorry when it came into the village of Hirafok, were the great bundles of timber that Adena had sawed down from his trees. And then it was time to head southwards again, climbing up into the central part of the Hogger, up towards the mountain of Asakrem, which was the site of our next base camp, and a place where we'd camped on many previous expeditions since 1970. It was a long, hard climb. This was an area that was familiar with us. Adena came with us because he was going on holiday now with his mates. He didn't have to do any guiding, but it was fun to have him along. And he did know a few little places that we didn't know, like this gelter, or rock pool, tucked away in a gorge. This is the kind of surprise which the desert can throw up. A place where there was cool water, plant life, lots of birds and insects, and frogs and fish in the water. Not at all the sort of thing that you'd associate with the open desert. And after the browns and reds of the open desert, wasn't it nice to see green again? The climb up into the mountains was hard work for the vehicles, and that meant hard work for the mechanics. The mechanics were the dirty men of the expedition, because you could guarantee that as soon as they washed and scrubbed themselves, something would break, and they'd have to get underneath the trucks again, and they'd be dirty all over again. But eventually we hauled up to 6,000 feet and the site of our Hogger base. Below the pinnacle of Suinan, there's a flat gravel patch that we've used on all of our previous expeditions. It's a kind of home from home, and certainly the youngsters who had been with us on previous trips recognised all the familiar sights, and the ones who hadn't been before recognised the familiar sights from the photographs they'd seen. This was to be our home for the next week or 10 days, and it was the only time on the expedition where we set up tents, because up at this altitude, at night, it can be quite chilly. The temperature drops to about 80 degrees, and it's 80 degrees in the middle of the Sahara. That's cold, and needs your parka on, you need your sweaters on, and your tracksuit bottoms. Suinan was the peak just behind camp, a beautiful spire of rock that could be seen from all parts of the surrounding desert. It was a good landmark, because this was the area where our youngsters went out on their individual expeditions. There's one of our mechanics up on the top, Kevin, celebrating his birthday. What a way to celebrate. The only problem was that his birthday tea was being served at that very moment down in base camp, and he was a long, long way from camp. While at base camp, the youngsters divided themselves up into groups of 3 or 4 and planned their own mini expeditions out into the surrounding mountains, where they'd be away from base for 2 or 3 days at a time, self-sufficient, living as the nomads would live, without tents or camp beds or stoves. They'd find caves or wadi bottoms to camp at night. They'd make a hollow in the sand to make themselves comfortable in their sleeping bags, and they'd look for camel dung or scrub on which to cook their meals. This particular group were off for a 72-kilometre trek through the mountains down to the oasis of Tamanrasset, because they were doing a 3-day expedition for their Duke of Edinburgh's Gold Award. And what a majestic landscape through which to walk. Meanwhile, back in camp, there was work to be done. The mechanics had to do the mechanicking. And everyone had ripped and battered clothes to repair. The duty groups got to grips with their hygiene, their table scrubbing, and their pot scouring. Water resupply was from the oasis of Tamanrasset, more than 70 kilometres away. On one of these trips, the vehicle that went down for the water broke down. And for 3 days, the Stranded Out Club was established. And the Stranded Out Club became a sort of minor camp, a splinter group of its own, where the members had the name Stranded Out Club written across their bare chests in felt marker, proudly proclaiming that they were a special group. They were staying with the broken down truck until the parts had been sent down from base with which to repair it. The quartermasters had the job of doing a stores check while they were at base camp. This was the halfway point of the expedition, when everything could be emptied out of the vehicles and checked for damage, checked against the logbooks for consumption, and repacked to make more space in the vehicles. And all the time, a Dana was a source of amusement and a source of information about the area. A Dana in his blue robes with his walking stick soon became a firm friend of every one of the expedition. At base camp, the pressure was off the youngsters. There was no need to rush around and keep schedules for travel. There was a chance for them to do their own thing. If your thing was working on the vehicles, so be it. If your thing was writing on your t-shirt, so be it. If your thing was sitting all night making pancakes round an open fire, so be it. Somebody would help you to eat them. One of the problems at base camp was that it was very windy. The tents were put up really to stop all the gear from being blown around the mountainside. Unfortunately, the tents themselves occasionally fell down, assisted by nighttime prowlers who went round to let their mates' tents down. Half of the stores have been consumed, but there's still a lot there, and it needs to be recatalogued and checked, and the crates cleaned out, and everything repacked. And of course there was the magnificent mountain scenery to explore. This was a chance for the youngsters to get out from under the feet of the adults and to do their own thing, to enjoy themselves, to explore themselves. And if you want to stay in camp all day long, playing with your vehicles, well, that was fun as well. Inevitably, there were the casualties. Up at 6,000 feet, the sunlight was more intense than on the surrounding plains, and some of the youngsters were caught unawares, and they suffered sunburn again. In the time at base camp, there was a chance for new skills to flourish. We had a resident hairdresser. And of course the diarists had a chance to catch up on their diaries. And the fashion conscious could get their good clothes out of their kit bags again. But eventually, our 10 days in the hogger passed, and it was time to head south, down into Niger and the Air Mountains. We descended from the mountains down onto the plain. The heat met us again. We headed down to the border between Algeria and the Republic of Niger. And we found that we weren't the only people heading south. One morning at breakfast, we were joined by a camel caravan. They were heading southwards towards a new grazing because in West Africa it was the time of the rains. The camels which had been bred in the desert were being taken down south for fattening, and then they'd be loaded up with salt and they'd journey back to the cattle lands to sell the salt in return for millet from the south. The caravan dried us for a drink of tea. And of course, we offered to replenish their water supply. They carried their water in goatskin bags and in inner tubes of old lorries. These inner tubes were cut in half and tied in knots at either end and loaded with water. And these great big black puddings of water containers could then be slung onto the camels again as a water reserve. And each evening a little bit more would be transferred to the goatskin bags, which caused the water to stay cool by evaporation. And so south into the sandy plains, heading down towards the border at Ingazam. At Launi, we had to pass through a depression of very soft sand, where for 20 or 30 miles we passed dozens and dozens of wrecks, where previous travellers had been caught in the same sands and stuck and broken their vehicles and abandoned them. Down past the strange rocks of Gara Eka, heading for the border and our customs checks. Soon after entering Niger, we were joined by an Italian family in a Range Rover. They tagged on to us because they weren't sure of the way. And indeed it was a rather trackless area that we were in. They weren't the most pleasant of people. And soon after deciding that they'd had enough of our company and had zoomed off into the distance, we gave a slight chuckle when this appeared over the horizon, a great sandstorm that obliterated all the tracks and left it dark for 3 or 4 hours. And so down into West Africa. And now we're in a different world. The desert was left behind. The Arab culture changed and gave way to Black Africa. And everything was green again. We camped up at Agadez and spent several days camped in the plantations and spent time going around the little garden plots, meeting the local families and enjoying ourselves, relaxing amongst the green and the cool. And watching the youngsters with their cow-powered irrigation systems. Then southward again, heading for the River Niger. West Africa is a land of contrasts. On one hand, we've got modern high-tech, a satellite dish receiving signals from satellites many miles above the Earth's surface. In the foreground, a straw hut village with its goats that hasn't changed much in the last hundreds of years. Handcrafts. And contrasts in architecture. And noisy markets where there was so much food available after the sparseness of the desert. And of course, the River Niger itself, where our intrepid explorers could sit and relax again. And then there were the people. People who came and talked, people who came and watched, people who were glad to see us there, people who became good friends. And there were other watchers as well. And so down to Niamey, the capital of Niger. We stayed in Niamey for 2 or 3 days, camped up on the campsite on the outskirts, and each morning we saw the goat herds coming down the main road, the morning milk round. And markets that were so full of bustle and life, great entertainment and a great source of presents and souvenirs. From Niamey, the expedition headed northwards, heading upriver along the banks of the River Niger. Each village we stopped at was different. At some, there were ferry points where canoes came across the Niger from the opposite bank. And inevitably, some of our explorers decided that they too were going to get a canoe and paddle off down the River Niger. It looks easy, but they found that it wasn't quite as easy as it looked. And the children were always ready to come round and join in the fun. Here's one little lad learning how to do, here's a church, here's a steeple. Probably dozens of youngsters now in this village, Niger, playing that same game. This being the wet season, we had more than our fair share of mud, and some evenings it was difficult to find a dry patch on which to set up camp. The further north we went, the more the road deteriorated, until after we passed the border with Mali, we came to an area where the road was just this. A sort of rubble-strewn track. We caught up with a Land Rover, a small short-wheelbase Land Rover which was waiting to cross a flooded area. The passengers had to get out, all 24 of them, and walk. Again, we found that wherever we camped, people would come and visit, and come and chat, come and watch. The women were fascinated by what our girls did. Our girls were fascinated by the women. And when we set up the table for a meal, it was difficult to tell who were our people and who were visitors. So heading north into Mali again, and here we found the rains had caused havoc along the tracks. There wasn't much traffic. Flooding was widespread, and the mosquitoes were everywhere. It was rather strange to think of our expedition as being a Sahara trip, and yet as we came along the River Niger, on the first leg of our return trip home, we spent more time wading through water than we had done wading through sand on the way south. And so, on the banks of the River Niger, at our furthest point from home, we leave the expedition. We still had a week of travelling across the Sahara back to the Mediterranean shore. and then another week travelling back across North Africa through Europe. But the best part of the expedition was now behind. What remained was 2 weeks of hard work to get back home on time.